Hello, and welcome to One-on-One with Robert Doar. I'm your host, Robert Doar, and thanks for tuning in today. As president of the American Enterprise Institute, I have the unique privilege of working with America's greatest policy experts. These scholars focus on policy issues in the fields of education, economics, energy, foreign and defense, and so much more. Subscribe to this podcast for exclusive access to in-depth discussions on the most pressing policy issues. Together, with my guests, we'll challenge political preconceptions, explore innovative ideas, and create, I hope, a freer and safer world. This week, we have the great pleasure of having Ed Pinto, the co-director of AEI's Housing Center, to talk about the state of the housing market, the enormous amount of work and benefits provided to the world of the housing industry that comes from the Housing Center's work, and what we can do to reduce, or I should say increase the affordability of housing in America so that more Americans can buy homes and raise families and get off to a good start. So that's the topic. Those are some of the topics we're going to cover. Ed, it's great to have you. Thanks for being here.
Pleasure being here, Robert. Thank you.
Okay, so let's start off with what is the Housing Center? I mean, you produce so much material, but what would you say the Housing Center was?
The Housing Center is a research center that we think of as a laboratory for housing research. We've created massive sets of data that we combine and analyze, and then we put those through various experiments and analysis to figure out how we can track what's actually going on in the housing market and come up with solutions, policy solutions that are based on facts and private market actions.
So along with your co-director, Tobias Peter, and a group of researchers here at AEI, you're producing regularly, monthly, maybe even bi-weekly,
yes.
Reports on the state of the housing market, upticks in prices, reports on the state of financing in the housing market. Your readership is very intense, I've found, is that in the community of people in the housing industry, they pay attention to what you guys are saying.
Absolutely, and we started out back in 2013 when the Housing Center was founded. We wanted to pull together data that would allow us to analyze what was going on in the housing market, and B, put that information out widely across not just the Washington area inside the Beltway, as it's called, but across the entire country. So we now have a list of 6,000 people that we regularly correspond with via email. We have thousands more that we use for various purposes. Plus, we're featured in AEI Today and AEI This Week, all the different things that AEI brings to bear, and speak to a lot of groups that AEI, through coalitions, has created and works with. So we're getting our word out across the fruited plain.
So what is the state of the housing market in the United States? Is prices are rising?
Prices are rising. The way I describe it to people is that the federal government is very good at inducing demand. It's very poor at adding supply. And local government is also very poor at adding supply due to limitations on zoning and other things. But the federal government has a very long history going back nearly 75 years, where there are programs that have been more demand creation programs than supply. So when the federal government says they're going to make housing more affordable, it means one of two things. Either they're going to make it easier to get a mortgage, so you borrow more, and we'll talk about that in the context of first-time buyers, or we're going to drive interest rates down to unsustainably low levels, which then unleash massive inflation that then has to be
Okay, but before you get into policy interventions on the demand or supply of housing, there is just a natural demand created by the strength of our economy. We have businesses and workers and wages are being paid, and people are graduating from college and earning money that they think should allow them to support the purchase of a home. So there's just natural demand that comes from people wanting to own homes. So that exists even without the federal government pushing it or prompting it. But am I right about that? Is there some pent up demand that's being unsupplied?
So first of all, demand is created by, as you've implied, jobs and wages. And that creates demand for housing, both owner and rental housing. And what we have found is that metropolitan areas that permit more housing and build more new housing relative to the jobs and wage increases will tamp down house price appreciation relative to other places. So the places that don't add much housing but add a lot of jobs get extremely high rates of house price appreciation and unaffordability, and places that try to keep up and do keep up do much better.
Okay, so I get that, and let's talk about that a little bit. The principal focus, and I should just point out to our listeners that if you want to find a easy and well expressed summary of the efforts that people could take to increase the supply of housing, and by increasing the supply of housing, reduce the price of housing, you cannot go to a better place than the AI Housing Center. You summarize it extremely well. You take it from the local to the federal, and you show how that can happen. But the goal is to create more housing.
Create more housing to meet whatever that demand is, whatever that growth is.
Okay, so, and I would say that your principal obstacle to creating more housing in the United States, I think you believe, and you make a strong case for, is local. That is state and local, usually often city or town, regulatory policies that just make it more expensive to build a home.
Absolutely. We believe that the limitation on having a abundant supply of housing is basically due to zoning and land use regulation. It is not due to lumber. It's not due to labor costs. It's not due to the other things that are mentioned. It fundamentally is due to these zoning and land use requirements, which do one thing. They drive up the cost of land, and land becomes a very key component to the price of new construction, and the price of new construction gets very expensive, particularly if the zoning requires a lot of land per house.
Right. So let's just talk about that one. That's a really good one. Very simple. Those of you who live in towns and communities around the country, if your zoning ordinance requires half acre or even a quarter acre to own before you can build a house on it, you're going to limit the supply of housing.
Absolutely.
What is the appropriate? I mean, what would be for a small town in the central business district? What is an acceptable lot size to you?
We think the acceptable lot size is something between 1,000 and 1,500 square feet, which would allow a townhome. Now, an owner of property could decide to have 5,000 square foot lots, but they should have the ability to build on 1,400 or 1,500 square foot lots. That used to be a relative norm. I've been to Ireland, and you go to these old villages, and there'll be a bunch of townhomes right near the taverns and the pubs that are in the little village. That, from 100, 200 years ago, that was normal. That was all outlawed back in the early 1920s, and we need to bring it back.
So listeners out there, pay attention to this, because that is a fundamental block to the creating of affordable housing, is the lot size requirements. Now, just one little caveat on that, Ed. What if someone said, well, the lot size requirements are dictated by environmental concerns like the absence of municipal sewer?
So the issue there becomes that if you're in an existing area, as you mentioned, near a downtown, that infrastructure is already in place. That infrastructure was generally built for more people than are living there today, because household size has gone down. But secondly,
so you're saying there are a lot of places with existing infrastructure that is appropriate that still require larger than their necessary lot sizes.
And think about it. If you had a city block that had the two sides and there were 12 houses along the city block, and you could put 24 homes, would you rather have 24 people paying into the sewer fund or 12? I'd rather have 24.
Okay, so lot sizes is a big one. You also make what's the next biggest one? The
next biggest one is just to allow a parcel to have more than one unit. That could be an accessory dwelling unit, a small unit that's either part of the main building or adjacent to the main building in the backyard or side yard, whatever, over the garage, or building a second unit on that property, or tearing down an old structure that we find that old structures 70, 80 years old. If in places with very high land values, their highest and best use is to tear that down. And if you're only allowed to build single-family detached, you will build what we call a McMansion. You'll replace a $600,000 or $700,000 property with a $2 or $3 million one, and you still only get no additional units because you just tore one down and built another. On the other hand, if you built 4 townhomes on that same 6,000 or 7,000 square foot lot, your price point is much lower. It would be probably near the $600,000 of the house that's torn down, and you'd get 3 more units. That would add to supply and make housing more affordable.
So more units, smaller lot sizes, parking.
Parking, you need to have some parking, but the closer you are to downtown areas and amenities, the less parking you need.
And a lot of these towns and communities all across America have onerous parking requirements on the builders. You must have 2 or 3 spaces when it's really not necessary.
Right. That is absolutely correct.
All of this drives up costs on a per unit basis.
It all drives up costs on a per unit basis. Some of these are able to be handled with the economics of new construction, but others that aren't, we call poison pills. So if you put an onerous parking requirement for an ADU, which isn't going to generate a lot of necessary parking requirements, you're going to make it so
What's an ADU?
Accessory dwelling units don't get built. If you have onerous requirements for townhomes, again, you're going to make it so economically you can't, because those parking spots have to be somewhere on that lot. And if you require that the land, which is very expensive, be used for parking, then you have less space for the house itself.
Okay, so where in America are communities and towns reforming these regulations that prevent the building of affordable housing? Just where's that happening?
It's happening in Houston, Texas. It's happening, which has been for quite a while, 30 years.
So let's be clear, listeners. Let's make sure we understand what Ed is saying there. Houston, Texas, big city in Texas, red state, Texas, has got policies and regulations that allow working class people to be able to afford homes. Where other places, blue states, maybe New York City, where I'm from, are those kind of reforms happening there?
Largely no. and so let's take Houston compared to Los Angeles.
There's a good one, even more blue.
And so we look at one of the results of the supply shortfall and unaffordability is homelessness. And so Los Angeles has 14 times the homeless rate per capita of Houston. That is largely because of housing supply.
Okay, well, there you go. You want to reduce homelessness? Allow people to build homes. And you're not, and honestly, Ed, are there some environmental concerns or public health concerns that you're worried that if people get really crazy about this are going to lead to real problems? Is there any downside to this?
We have not seen a downside where it's been done. Houston, we've studied going back 25 years. We just found a place in Denver. We can go back 45 years. Austin they reduced lot sizes in Austin just a few months ago, so it hasn't had an impact yet. But if talk about environmental, I just discovered some data that a 1,500 square foot home that's say 70 years old would use X amount of energy for that house, that 1,500 square foot house. If you were to build a 1,500 square foot house today, that same house at 1,500 square feet would use 1/3 the energy. So if you tear down an old home and build on that lot that's 6,000 square feet and were to build 3 townhomes, you're actually building 3 homes using the same amount of energy as the one you tore down. But
Yeah. So I want to get clear what Mr. Pinto is saying there. What he's saying is that I raised the issue of environmental concern, and what's the biggest environmental concern to many people in America now? It's climate change and the excessive use of energy that contributes to the warming of the planet. At least that's their way of seeing it. And so that's the number one environmental concern. And Mr. Pinto's agenda on building more housing in greater density is good for that too. And yet and yet we still can't do it.
And it's also good for what they call vehicle miles traveled, which is what is used. And if you're building where there are amenities, you're living closer to those amenities, and you have the opportunity to work nearby is increased and shop nearby, and therefore you need for cars less, which also means you don't need as much parking.
Yeah, and I want to say that, sometimes people on the right are accused of being, suburbanites and people that dwell in exclusive environments and communities. What Mr. Pinto is talking about here is much higher density downtown communities where people can live together, a variety of backgrounds, variety of income levels, in a much better, in my opinion, a much better, more community-like environment. And yet, these zoning and regulation policies are preventing that kind of organic development of communities that look like New York City.
The irony is many of these communities, the older ones, are today the most sought-after communities in the country. So Georgetown is cited, but a couple months ago, our team was out in San Francisco and other cities in California, and we went to the Sunset District. And the Sunset District is adjacent to the Pacific Ocean. It was built in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They were houses on 1,400 square foot house, single-family detached homes on 1,400 square foot lots with virtually no backyard. The front yard was very small. Was near
and that's
the
where
sidewalk.
Everybody wants to live.
And that's where everybody wants to live.
There you go. Yeah. See,
what's wrong with it?
Why can't we have that? And I don't understand it. So that's the local picture. I just want to be clear, and I think this is very. The Obama administration wrote a report when they were in office saying that if you want to increase affordability for housing, the number one thing was local zoning. So Ed is not an outlier here. This is the consensus view of a lot of people, but it's hard to change.
It's hard to change
because of NIMBYism and and it's really hard to change in Berkeley, California, for instance.
Yes. So the reason we went to Sunset District is that's where NIMBYism was born. Okay. That was the birthplace.
Okay. All right, so that's the local scene. Now let's talk about the federal scene and the global scene. I'm going to skip over, eliminating Davis-Bacon prevailing wage requirements on residential construction because that's long-standing wish. The one that I found most interesting was lowering tariffs on construction materials that add thousands of dollars to the cost of construction, which home builders pass on to consumers. Is that really a big, serious issue?
That is a serious issue. Particularly Canada is a big place where we can import lumber. Canada is a big supplier of lumber, and we have tariffs on Canadian lumber. And if those tariffs didn't exist, we'd be getting more lumber from Canada.
And more lumber at a lower price that translates into more affordable
as
housing.
I said, lumber isn't the
and
huge
come on,
issue.
Donald Trump, you're a builder of homes and housing. Come on, you can't be for tariffs on lumber.
Right.
That's slowing down the construction.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, well, all right, there you go. You also have something about I thought was very interesting is that we lock up national forests, and so that our own supply of our own potential lumber is being restricted by government regulation that, again, drives up the cost of housing.
And that lumber needs to be harvested and should be harvested, but it's not allowed to be.
Okay, and one more about you refer to onerous federal energy standards on appliances. And give me what are we talking about there?
We're talking about requirements on shifting from gas furnaces to electric. So there's a push to eliminate gas. Gas is the least expensive appliance type and utility cost, and so lower income homeowners and renters are going to benefit from being able to use gas. Well, gas is now being phased out around many cities and states, number one. And then one of the ways it's being phased out is to require very expensive, either new furnaces have various requirements that they have to meet, or if you have to have a repair done to a furnace, it has to have a very large repair done to bring it up to current standards. Again, this is making things, heating your home, out of reach for many home buyers.
Another great example of the excessive regulation on climate that's harming low-income and working-class Americans by driving up the costs of living for them. And really, I think an argument can be made, it's very little long-term benefit on the climate.
In fact, gas, up until 8 or 10 years ago, gas was viewed by the environmental lobby as a solution until it became plentiful. Once it became plentiful, they realized, wait a minute, too many people are going to use gas. We'd rather they use something else. And so they turned against gas. But gas it's not a perfect solution, but it has a much lower carbon footprint than oil and even to some extent electricity.
Okay, one last one I want to ask you about that is a federal policy, and that is the mortgage interest tax deduction on second homes. Tell us about that one and how it affects the housing market.
So, as I said, the federal government is very good at inducing demand, and it's very poor at adding supply. It really doesn't add any supply. And so, but it can induce demand, and it induces demand in second homes by subsidizing it through a interest tax deduction. A home that's a second home, it's only called a second home because somebody already owns a first home. That home is perfectly usable as a primary residence by just about anybody. And therefore, if 7% or whatever it is, 7 million homes in the country are second homes, and we're subsidizing those through the tax code, over time, if you did away with that subsidy, fewer homes would be second homes. They would convert to primary residences.
Okay, so just to put this as bluntly as possible, take that, rich people. You're not going to get this subsidy to have your second home. And that's coming from Ed Pinto at the American Enterprise Institute.
That's right.
In his desire to what? Create more housing.
Increase housing supply. And that's something the federal government could do. And over 10 years, we estimate it would add about 700,000, free up about 700,000 second homes to convert to primary residences. Well, that's almost 1 year's production. In 10 years, that's huge.
So I just want to say, I've come from the world of helping low-income Americans through various safety net programs, and I've been around housing people because they're in that world too. There's no one who's fighting harder for helping middle-income and lower-income Americans afford homes than Ed Pinto with the right policy solutions. And yet, well, not in yet, and he's doing it at the American Enterprise Institute. It's a really great story, which we're very proud of here at AEI. And Ed, I want you to keep at it and don't let up. Keep pushing on helping us create more housing. But now let's talk about the market, because you do watch the market very carefully. And so here's my short version of what I think is happening. There's not enough supply. One of the things that's a little interesting about the demand is, we supposedly have this birth dearth and our population is leveling off, but we also have immigration. So whatever the birth dearth is doing, plus immigration, there's still a lot of people that want housing. So the population changes in the United States are not affecting the demand and supply of housing. It's growing and people want homes. So that's happening. Interest rates have risen, and a lot of people are in homes that they financed when they had much lower interest rates. And they know that if they sell their house, they're going to cash in that mortgage, and they're going to have to go borrow to buy the next house at a much higher interest rate. So there's a little bit of a lock going on. Is that right? Is that correct?
That is absolutely right. The lock has a second feature, which is if you do sell your house and lose that mortgage, what do you buy? You have to find something to move to. And there's a dearth of housing to move to.
And if you don't have enough money in cash, you're going to have to finance it at higher interest rates.
There's a much higher interest rate. So it's a two-edged sword. It's both losing the low mortgage rate that you have, and then what do you replace the house you're moving from with?
And then, notwithstanding that and the other problems that we've talked about, it seems to me you have done, so prices are rising, there's not enough supply, there is a lot of activities. Activity is happening, but you did a deep dive on first-time home buyers, and I think you found that actually they're still in there. They're still buying homes.
They are still buying homes, but truth be known, many fewer homes are being sold today than a few years ago because of the lack of supply. So first-time buyers are in there bidding for homes and getting homes at an increasing percentage. However, the total number of homes that are selling is going down.
Okay, and then let's assume for a moment that you can find the house, you can find the price that you're willing to buy, and then you needed to make your financing arrangements. Ed, I think you come from that world of the housing market, the financing side. I think you do.
I do.
Tell us what you think is the optimal way to finance a home given the current environment we're in.
So that leads to two questions. One is debt, how much debt you take on. And I was going over with our staff the other day, and I was explaining that back in the early 50s, with an FHA loan, a Federal Housing Administration loan, your housing debt ratio was 14%, meaning pre-tax you spent 14% of your income on principal, interest, taxes, and insurance and mortgage insurance. What we found in the study that we just published is that has gone up to 24% from 14, but the 24 didn't include all the things that were in the 14. If you adjusted for all the things that were in the 14, it goes up to 32%. So the 14's gone to 32. What does that mean in the context of my experience? Well, when I was involved with this at Fannie Mae back in the 80s, we set for Fannie Mae a limit of 28% for that ratio. So that was the limit. We now have first-time buyers that are averaging 32, which means there's a bunch well above that.
Right. So just to boil that down, people are paying greater portions of their income to finance the purchase of homes.
So what people should be doing, A, there's a huge variation in prices both within a market and across markets. So within a market, the size of the house and the type of the house and the location relative to areas of amenities makes a huge difference. So what we have found, and this goes back to talking about townhouses versus single-family detached, as you move smaller single-family detached, the price goes down. New construction, the price goes down. Same thing for existing. As you move from single-family detached to single-family attached, the price and size continues to go down. There's still family-sized houses, but the price goes down a lot as you move to smaller homes.
Okay, so first advice is move to higher density areas where the zoning regulations allow the creation of these smaller units that are more closely together.
That's the first choice.
And there are a lot of places.
And there are a lot of places. There are townhouse developments that localities have allowed townhouse developments. They just haven't allowed them to mix in single-family detached areas. Okay. The second thing is, and what we find is there's a huge variation in home prices across the country. Relative to incomes. You have San Francisco and Los Angeles where that relationship is 10 to 1. Homes cost 10 times the median home price. And then you have places, Pittsburgh and Syracuse and other places, where homes are 3 to 1 or 3.2
Much more affordable.
Much more affordable. So if you can work from home, as an option, or you have family in wherever, then you should be looking at how can I use this difference in market prices across the country. There's still a wide range of prices across the country. We still have a lot of housing that is affordable. It's just not in places like California and New York.
Okay. All right. So look for places where affordable homes are. And then you also don't you like 20-year mortgages over 30-year mortgages and
we like
a bigger down payment so you lower your monthly payments and you can build equity faster. Isn't that one of your principal themes?
That is one. It's become very difficult to do that because house prices have really outpaced incomes. They were outpacing it from 2012 to 2019, but starting with the pandemic and all of the things that the Fed was doing, that has increased substantially further, and it becomes very difficult to do what we were suggesting 8 or 10 years ago.
Okay, so now we've talked about the solutions that you think work and that have been proven to work in the past, and I didn't want to spend too much time on this, but the fact of the matter is that these are they're complicated, they're hard, there's a lot of variation across the country. When a candidate for president, for instance, or a person who's going to be in the United States Congress is talking about these issues, they are quick to what you call go for demand-side solutions, which are basically handouts. They're basically subsidizing people for various reasons with, credits, tax credits, and they're giveaways.
or just loosened underwriting.
Or loosened underwriting. And you in the center develops a lot of research showing why that's actually not very effective, could be ultimately harmful to people who get caught in a situation they can't later afford if they run into hard times. I get all that, but don't you find that this problem of solving a problem like this, the cost of housing, with these kinds of solutions is a bipartisan problem? Don't you?
Absolutely.
I mean, give us a little sense of that. It's so much easier.
The best example of that is probably the low-income housing tax credit, which is used to partially fund large multifamily, 50 units plus per building. And we had a conference on this a couple months ago, we call it the 5 C's are the problems. It's complex, it's costly, there's corruption, there's crowding out, and you're dealing with the cartel. It's a cartel of builders and advocacy groups that promote these subsidies. And it's a very small cartel. And they have a lot of money for lobbying. So you put those 5 together, and the program actually isn't doing what it's advertised to be doing for those 5 reasons. And so we approach it from a very different perspective. We've done about 20 case studies, 18 of them in the United States, 2 of them in foreign countries, where we've looked at things that have worked, and in a couple of cases, things that haven't worked. And we've now developed what we call a housing abundance success sequence that basically says if you put a couple things in place, number one is by right zoning, which means the locality, the planning board, et cetera, do not have discretion to say yes or no. It's by right. Number 2, you have keep it short and simple regulations, the KISS rule. That will, in every case we studied, unleash lots of housing bubbling up from the bottom, and that will continue for decades. And that is the success sequence.
Okay, so last question for our listeners, just globally in the United States. And I'm not trying to stump you here, and so if you don't have the answer, I'm sorry. How many housing units are there for sale, not rentals? Let's just do for sale. And how many will be added to the supply of housing in the United States this year? So what is the global number we're trying to increase from A to B?
So there's about 110 million total housing units, but about 2/3 of them are owner-occupied. But again, it can shift from rental to owner. So but around at any given point, around 2/3 are owner-occupied. So you're looking at around 67 million. And we're adding, again, we had single family, we had multifamily. Yeah. I think we're adding about 800,000, give or take, single family. That's been increasing. We add about 300,000 or 400,000 multifamily. But there's also teardowns. And so you add X and then you lose some. Okay. You lose a couple 100,000 due to tearing down, fires, disasters, et cetera.
Let's go back.
So you might be adding 600,000 in a year.
600,000 housing units in a year against a base of 67 million. And what should it be?
Well, that great question. The question really is, well, how many housing units are we short, which is difficult to figure out. All I know is I believe it's in the millions. Could it be 3 million? Potentially. Could it be 7 million? Potentially. I generally use 3.5 million.
Okay.
And you also you mentioned demographics.
Okay, so let's just get this straight. I'll pick 4 million.
Okay.
We need 4 million more housing units in the United States. And right now we're producing about, did you say 600,000
give or take,
a year? Well, that's terrible. So what's your hope for increasing that to 1 million a year in the next 5 years?
So we have done, our analysis shows that if you were to do what we call light touch density, these duplex, triplex, townhouses.
And just so let's be clear, you have to do that in multiple communities all across the country.
In places where it's economically viable.
Yes,
which is
but it's got to happen by local changes.
Yeah.
It's
if you were
a
to
little
do
harder
that,
to do than changing a federal statute.
Right.
But if you were to do that,
you would add 800,000 additional units a year.
Okay. Well, that's the progress.
So
let's make some...
That's the solution.
Okay, so last question, Ed. I hate to put you on the spot here.
Again.
But I know one of the great things about Mr. Pinto and Tobias and his team is that they're not afraid to take their message, to out into the country and to local communities and to make their arguments, given that a lot of these issues do play out at the local communities. Do you have a place where your efforts to get them to reform their zoning and building regulations have been successful, and you're watching to see whether that burst in supply of housing happens?
Yes, two would be Charlotte, North Carolina, where we've been very involved in that with the planning department and others. And the second would be Austin, Texas, where we were initially involved with a mayor candidate who got elected. We're currently, and it's a work in progress, very interested, very involved in Texas.
Okay.
Generally.
So Texas generally, Austin specifically, and Charlotte. And I would point out to our listeners, Charlotte's an interesting one because 10 years ago, when I first came to AI, a scholar from Harvard, Raj Chetty, produced a report which showed that Charlotte was the worst performing community in the country when it came to poverty. As this is my memory. And Charlotte woke up and realized they had a lot of problems. And I think I'll bet you that in addition to other things, they're facing up to housing affordability in a way. So I'm going to watch that carefully. I'd love it, Ed, if you could say that tell me what their increase in supply was from point A to point B or date A to date B. Do
a
you
lot
know
of
that?
litigation going on.
Still fighting.
Still fighting.
Okay. Come on, Charlotte. Loosen up those regulations. Allow working class people to be able to afford a house.
So one last thing, we have an explainer video that's coming out, just got finished, and it's focused on Charlotte.
Okay.
So
good. Charlotte, the eyes of the world are upon you.
Exactly.
Thanks for being with us, Ed. We'll see you next time.
Always a pleasure.